Hello and welcome to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. I'm Elizabeth Filippouli, founder of Athena 40, an international platform promoting female leadership and connecting individuals from around the world to exchange knowledge and insights. In this podcast series, we are interviewing thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and decision makers. We're bringing you insights related to developments triggered by the coronavirus crisis, and we speak with pioneering women from across different industries and countries. Today, I'm interviewing Lisbeth Pillegrad, Executive Director of the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy. The Institute concentrates its efforts in contributing to the development of well-functioning democratic political parties and also multi-party systems in strong democratic cultures in emerging democracies. Lisbeth, welcome to Bouncing Back.
Thank you so much.
Would you explain a bit about the Institute's work and your area of focus?
Yes, certainly. The Institute is 10 years old, so it's a fairly young institute, but was established on a quite interesting note by the majority of the political parties in the Danish parliament. They came together and wanted to see a way where all the lessons learned and the many years of democratic history and experience could inspire other countries in their development of democracy. So the political parties came together and established this institute that is based out of Copenhagen and works in more than 16 different countries globally. We work directly with political parties in Denmark, who then work with their parties and associated parties in different locations, as well as the Institute has established its own collaborations with multi-party institutions, both in Africa and in Asia. Besides this, we have offices in Myanmar, and we have an office or a representation in Nepal.
So you are in touch with those different chapters around the world. I would like to invite you to give us some insights as to how these different countries and different societies have handled this crisis, which is a global crisis, but of course affects people and societies on a national level. So if you could give us a brief overview of what has been going on, or perhaps the most interesting or impressive or different insights from the countries that you operate in.
Yes, as you say, it's affected countries and regions differently, and we are in the middle of the pandemic crisis. So we're only seeing the start in some countries of their reaction and fighting against the COVID, whereas other countries are moving towards flattening the curve and starting to reopen societies. So the picture is quite diverse when I look to the different countries that we operate with. But certainly there's a great concern, particularly in those countries with a weak health system, where the infrastructure of government and national entities are not that strong. And of course that concern is duly, because if the pandemic hits hard, people will really suffer and will have difficulties in approaching proper health care. However, in several of the countries, and when I speak to colleagues and stakeholders, there is a possibly even greater concern about the financial and economic impact of these crises and what it does to families in terms of making sure that they can actually provide for their families, to have a daily income. In many countries, people do not have a regular salary and are not employed, so they will have to fight for themselves and their families, and they do that by day to day finding ways of making an income. With the lockdowns that had happened in many countries, I think more than 120 countries have had either a full lockdown or a partial lockdown of societies. That has certainly affected the more vulnerable part of the population to actually care for their families.
Well, what we see currently is more than 3/4 of the world's children, they live under stay-at-home orders during the outbreak. And we have seen a new report, a shocking report, I would say, that finds that child mortality rate could increase for the first time in more than 60 years. So more than 1 million children under the age of 5, could die over the next 6 months as a result of the secondary impact of the coronavirus outbreak, such as disruptions to health services and access to food. While we're trying to protect some groups of people from COVID-19, these lockdown measures are leaving others to die helpless.
Certainly, it is a challenge with the situation, and I think we are all, and our different countries and governments are struggling with finding an approach to balance the impact of a pandemic and to balance the safety and well-being of the large part of their populations. Well, I think that there has been a natural eagerness to try and stop the spread of the coronavirus. But I think we've also struggled in finding a way of living with such a virus. And possibly if we look into the future, this would be one of the scenarios that we will be challenged with different kinds of viruses and different kinds of attacks that will be in our societies. So maybe the thinking that we can eliminate fully the risk and the challenges we are now facing might be unrealistic, and instead that we would have to find a more long-term approach where we are able to sustain a proper livelihood for majority of the population, while we still protect and take care that we are not losing too many to such health dangers. But it's certain from speaking to colleagues in Africa and in other locations, they've said clearly, we will not die from the virus, we'll die from hunger first. And I think that says it very clearly, one of the main challenges of the situation.
This is a terrible situation. And as we know, neoliberalism is under attack as a system, as an economic ideology of capitalism. It's been accused of having depleted public services and turned education and healthcare into profit-driven businesses and favoring profit over human security and well-being. Do you agree? And are we in need of a new economic system?
Well, it's certainly that we are posed with challenges and that our current economic system seems to be quite fragile when such a crisis hits. So I'm not sure I have the final answer to what kind of system, but I think for sure that looking at an even larger challenge that is raised, the issue of climate change and the impact on our planet, with this comes to my mind of having the possibility for now to look at a more greener approach to how we are going to continue living on this planet and taking care of it. And that might affect the way that we structure our financial systems.
And of course, there are many issues that are threats to democracy and democratic processes that arise through this pandemic. One of them being surveillance, and that surveillance storm that we're now witnessing. So researchers are in the process of developing new forms of public health monitoring and tracking systems and applications. But releasing personal data to private companies and governments carries risks to our individual and collective rights. We are opening the door to our private lives, preferences and choices. And I can't help to wonder, how democratic is that? And what is the risk towards our human rights as individuals?
Yes, it is certainly a risk. And I think it is another challenge of how to approach, and certainly in here in Denmark, it's been discussed fiercely, since there are quite strong legislation of protecting the individual rights and our personal information. And it's a balance. However, we've seen in some countries that it's where they've had quite developed surveillance, South Korea, for example, that it has been helpful in tracking down the virus. So of course it is a dilemma, and with all such modalities. There are others besides surveillance. I mean, the lockdown in some countries has immense effect on political parties that are now unable to gather and meet and who do not have proper means in terms of technology as we in other parts of the world are with our laptops and our Zooms and our other digital platforms, smartphones and so on, that those means simply do not exist in some countries. So the ability to gather democratically and discuss and develop politically seems to be quite hampered. So certainly surveillance is a challenge, and it's particularly a challenge where countries are maturing democracies or developing democracies, and where we do not know which direction it will take, where political leaders might utilize this information for other than the purpose of good in terms of the pandemic, but rather use it for other means. And that is certainly a great concern.
Who can protect us from these good intentions? And what I mean by that is that citizens, in their majority, do not really understand or appreciate the level of threat that is against our lives and privacy and rights. And we see that by the way people share their private data on social media, on Facebook, social networks. So they're being careless, and perhaps they do not comprehend the extent of privacy breach, and that they are opening a window to data which are sensitive and which the private institutions take advantage of for profit. Who can protect people from that?
Well, as you say, we are all more or less or not well prepared or well educated in terms of protecting our data. So I don't think you can put the responsibility at the individual level, but it's a global level. And I know within the EU that there is quite intensive work being done in terms of protecting data in an EU setting, and hopefully that can inspire other global institutions also to look at this, because I think it's a global challenge and it needs to be tackled from a larger perspective than from the individual perspective.
Talking about global institutions and the EU, are you happy with the way the World Health Organization or the European Union have handled these crises? Are you happy with their response, the ways that they have been dealing with the pandemic, the outbreak, the effect on people and societies?
Well, happy is perhaps not the word I would be using. And I think, as for many, this is a new and so different situation we're in. So it's difficult to already now evaluate and give points to the different institutions. From my personal point of view, I think WHO have done quite a bit and have tried their best. I also know globally that it's a UN entity that has struggled with funding. So it points back to member states and how they are supporting our international institutions. They're only as strong as the backing they're getting from member states. Looking at the EU, I think we all agree that it has not been that successful in responding to the situation in many different ways. And I think that will be a huge challenge for all us Europeans to the EU, and look to how certainly instruments can be improved. I mean, I'm a strong believer in the EU, but I also see the weaknesses that have happened during the pandemic situation. But I don't see an alternative to the EU. So we would have to improve and respond. But looking globally, I think it's important to now reach out also in solidarity with the countries and regions that are less fortunate in terms of having systems put in place. And there, I think we have a job to do in this part of the world and also in the EU.
So, Elizabeth, I guess the bottom line is that there will be a massive impact on employment. Corporations are already asking for bailouts. The care burden on women is already massive. We talked about the effect on our freedoms and human rights. Our mobility, of course, is different. And I'm wondering whether we can use this momentum to transform how our societies operate, how our governance models operate, and whether we can breed a new generation of accountable leaders and societies which will be values-driven rather than profit-driven.
Well, that would be really nice if new, creative, and different thinking came out of such a crisis. And I hope and believe that we will be able to think critically and constructive about how to organize our societies and do not return to business as normal, trying to respond to the crisis with old traditional means. I don't think that is the way forward. So indeed, we are in need of young people and the youth to engage in societies, to engage in our democracies, and not turn away. Unfortunately, are faced with a fatigue among not only youth, but populations in general of engaging in their democracies. Just to mention that the decreasing number of people who engage in traditional political parties is quite broadly a challenge. So what do we do in terms of engaging newly? And I hope that out of these crises, there are also some new ways and some constructive ways of how we live together and organize. All this technology is a huge challenge, but we are also able to reach out to people that we haven't listened much to. And we've also been able to invite people in to conversations they before were not part of. So I hope that we will also see some of the positive effects of this terrible situation. I know it's going to be very, very hard, and it will take a long time for societies to recover, but hopefully they will also really look critically at the way they should recover, and what is needed is certainly, from my point of view, that we also look to the environment, to the climate, and the way we utilize the resources on this planet.
How is the Institute preparing for the next day of the crisis, so for the new normal?
Well, we're still in that process, I believe, because it's still fairly new. And we are certainly challenged on having the ability not to meet, not to travel, not to organize large gathering, which is a big part of our work in trying to support democratic forces around the world. That is meeting face to face, building that trust and exchanging information. So we are also trying to find new means of digital reaching out and maintaining and developing these relationships that we have globally, until and if we are able to meet again physically and in person across the globe. So yes, there are certainly many challenges, but we are looking at, as I said, the digital and what we can do to support even in hardware, because there are countries, if we look at the most conflict-ridden countries, only 19% have access to the internet, for example. So what can we do in terms of supporting people to join the digital world now that this is one of the major platforms of communication? I think that will be essential. And then to support all the different initiatives and the inclusion still of women and youth into politics, which I think is very important.
Lisbeth Pilograd, thank you very much for your time today and our conversation.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. Stay tuned, more episodes coming up. Please feel free to subscribe. Athena 40 is hosting conversations with thought leaders, entrepreneurs, influencers, and decision makers from all over the world in this effort to find our new normal. You can find more information on us on athena40forum.com. Follow us on Twitter on Athena_40. Stay safe, stay inspired.